My name is Patricia Kovacevic. I'm an attorney and regulatory expert, and I have the great honor to be moderating a panel of experts today. We will discuss why is it imperative that we accelerate the fight against illicit trade in tobacco products with best practice recommendations from those who are involved firsthand in minimizing illicit trade. Before introducing our outstanding speakers and before a few housekeeping items, it is my pleasure to introduce the president of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, Dr. Derek Yak, a global health expert and anti-smoking advocate for more than 30 years. Dr. Yak is also a passionate advocate for health promotion and disease prevention. He is a former World Health Organization Cabinet Director and Executive Director for Non-Communicable Diseases and Mental Health, where he was deeply involved with the development of the world's Treaty on Tobacco Control, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, or FCTC, which you will hear being mentioned here today numerous times. Dr. Yak is also the former Chief Health Officer of the Vitality Group, Executive Director of the Vitality Institute, Senior Vice President, Global Health and Agriculture Policy at PepsiCo, Director of Global Health at the Rockefeller Foundation, and a professor of global health at Yale University. He has authored or co-authored more than 250 articles on global health and has served on several advisory boards, including the World Economic Forum, Cornerstone Capital, and Wellcome Trust. Derek, may I please ask you to share with us your opening remarks?
Great. Thank you, Patricia. And let me first thank Patricia for moderating and giving continuous guidance on a lot of these issues, and also my colleague Ada Urukli for her conceptual development of this program and a lot of our work on economics. Obviously, a huge thanks to Liz Allen, David Child, and Chris Martin, and we'll hear lots from them. It's a real privilege to have you join us and address what I think is one of the most crucial issues to be able to address in terms of tobacco control. Let me just go back a couple of years and remind us why. The very first resolution of the World Health Assembly on tobacco control was in 1970. And that was when it simply raised the fact that there was a need to start tackling tobacco use around the world. At the time, there were no real estimates of the total number of deaths. And the main recommendation made in 1970 was we need to educate people a lot better about the dangers. By 1978, though, the resolution put to the World Health Assembly for the first time called for the use of taxes on tobacco as one of the most powerful means of reducing consumption, both among adults and also to stop kids coming in. And since then, since 1978, there have been repeated calls for that by the WHO. By 1999, the World Bank got involved through their report Curbing the Epidemic, which many on this call, including Ada, know very well since they were involved in different ways in its development. And of course, Curbing Epidemic made the critical point that while excise taxes are the most powerful single means of reducing long-term consumption, one needs to address illicit trade simultaneously if you're going to have the benefits of that occur. And with that in mind, it was not surprising that in the Framework Convention final text that got adopted in 2003, both excise tax and the counter side, illicit trade, are addressed. And now, as you know, the very first protocol of the Framework Convention on illicit trade was discussed, negotiated, and actually came into force already. It's kind of surprising and worrying that so few countries actually have made progress that we hoped for all those years ago on both raising the taxes to the level that we thought would have an impact on consumption. And WHO's own reports that got put in front of the executive board in January this year show that of all the interventions with effectiveness, this one has actually made the least progress. This is stunningly worrying. And of course, part of it may be due to economic pressures within the countries, other may be due to fears of illicit trade. We know that this is an issue that, unless addressed adequately, will not allow us to have the health gains of an excise tax policy that reduces consumption. During the Framework Convention process, people often forget that there was an interesting side event on illicit trade held at the United Nations. And that was actually co-funded by Tobacco, Alcohol, and Firearms Bureau of the US government and the UN, mainly because they had started uncovering smuggling between North Carolina and Michigan. The end result of that led to the very first terrorist charges being brought against somebody in the US in 2011 because the funding from the smuggling of tobacco taxes was going to fund Hezbollah operations in Lebanon. I mention that because that shows the seriousness with which one needs to tackle these issues. And as an update, just last month, one of the major tobacco companies joined forces with the Department of Homeland Security in the US to continue to strengthen work in addressing illicit tobacco use and its potential links to criminality and terrorism, to remind us how important that is. Before ending, I would say that there are a couple of new frontiers that we need to start thinking about. The growth of harm reduction products, whether they're heated tobacco, e-cigarettes, the liquid component, the components, all lend themselves to both illicit trade of different types, counterfeit as a big issue, and we'll have to add that into the armamentarium and the language, which is currently certainly not the case either in the protocol or in the Framework Convention. Secondly, I think we need to start addressing the complexity of how you deal with illicit trade in a world in which technology options are becoming far more available. And there, I do think that we have to turn to where progress is being made inside some of the industry. The complexity of tracking and tracing systems, the IP behind them, the ability to use them is now being used to track and trace products, all major consumer goods groups. And it's actually the private sector. In our case, it might be the tobacco and e-cigarette companies. I was at PepsiCo and know that in the case of that sector, the food sector and a company like Nestle were way ahead in understanding how to track and trace products to ensure that they don't seep into the illegal market and that the safety components are controlled throughout the supply chain. That rigor and that capability is not being adequately discussed within the WHO forum, which actually discourages discussions with the very sector who may have the solution to solve some of these problems. So let me just end there, and I really look forward to the deliberations in what I hope will be an ongoing, very important discussion, because I think you all know, lying at the base of this are 8 million people who die every year from tobacco. We won't make progress unless we actually take the issues of excise taxes and their counterpartner, illicit trade, far more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Appreciate the introduction. A couple of housekeeping items before I move to introducing our distinguished panel today. First and foremost, my understanding is that there may be a little bit of delay in providing interpreting services. So please bear with us on that. I think that is in the process of being addressed. Second, I will ask the speakers to speak relatively slowly and clearly. I'm trying to do that myself for the interpreters to be able to obviously provide the simultaneous translation. And last but not least, we will kindly ask you to type the questions in the chat box, mindful of the fact that we will address the questions at the very end of all presentations in the interest of better communication, but also because remember, one or another of the presenters may already possibly answer your questions. So hold on to questions until the very end of the third presentation, type them in the chat box, and we will address them. If you know who you want the questions to be addressed to, please feel free to type the name of the panelists. If not, we will direct the question to the right panelist. So our speakers today are Liz Allen, David Child, and Chris Martin. And they're all from the United Kingdom with backgrounds in Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and also in her, whatever it was called before, Her Majesty's Customs and Excise. I will introduce first Ms. Liz Allen. In her final 12 years, in over 35 years of government service, Liz Allen led the first United Kingdom review of alcohol and tobacco fraud that gave rise to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs Tobacco Strategy. She was head of an excise tax administration division for 6 full years. Since 2009, she has worked as a consultant, mainly in 8 projects involving indirect taxes in developing countries, especially in Africa. Liz was also a member of the OECD Task Force Tobacco Subcommittee. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Ms. Liz Allen.
Thank you, Patricia, for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone watching. And thank you to the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World for asking me to put together this webinar. I've drawn on the work of some customs and revenue experts and my own experience, of course, in HM Revenue and Customs, and as Patricia said, prior to merger in 2005 in HM Customs and Excise. Today's webinar will look first at the context, then I will air some personal thoughts about why we need to do more to reduce illicit trade in tobacco products, despite having in place the FCTC's illicit trade protocol. In my second presentation, I will explain the main components and achievements of the UK's strategy to combat illicit trade in tobacco products. Next slide, please. So on to the meat of today's event. What is illicit trade? You see here that I am using the WHO definition, which is quite broad. You are probably all aware of the implications of illicit trade in tobacco products in undermining health policies and tax revenues, as Derek has said. And members of the WHO have spent years of their lives working up the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, or FCTC, and the Illicit Trade Protocol, or ITP, with the aim of eliminating illicit trade in tobacco products. The FCTC and ITP represent major steps forward, both in raising awareness of this illicit trade around the world and in looking at ways that countries can work together to eliminate it. Unfortunately, although many countries have now implemented the ITP, there is still a vast amount of illicit trade in tobacco products. So why has this happened? Let's start by looking at the scope of illicit trade in tobacco products. Tobacco products can be domestically produced, but not declared to the Revenue Authority, so not tax paid. The products can be smuggled either across formal border points or informal porous borders. And when the WHO started to focus on this illicit trade, the method first identified was the illicit import of genuine products, i.e. large-scale smuggling of genuine branded cigarettes. Nowadays, in many countries, the illicit tobacco trade is far more varied. Other types of illegal imports are counterfeits and cheap whites. Cheap or illicit whites are terms used to describe cigarettes produced legally in one country, usually by smaller, low-profile businesses, but these are manufactured with the intent of being exported legally and then smuggled and sold in another country. And that's usually a country with higher rates of tax on the products. Finally, illicit imports also include the abuse of legal privileges. That is, situations where buyers, consumers exceed their allowances for imports of otherwise legal tobacco products. So, despite the many years of discussions, the ITP was never going to cover all the types of illicit trade in tobacco products, merely those products made by legitimate, and by that I mean registered or licensed or approved manufacturers. I will come back to this later. Next slide, please. There are several methods of estimating the size of illicit trade. The main ones are empty pack surveys, comparison of revenue collected with consumer survey results, and seizures. They all have their pros and cons. Empty pack surveys, if carried out in a statistically robust manner, can give a reasonable picture for the population at that point in time. That is the method carried out in the EU by an annual KPMG survey. Consumer survey statistics usually have to be increased by a percentage to compensate for the underdeclaration by consumers. While the data based on seizures is, for many countries, solid, using it to estimate the total size of the illicit tobacco market is risky. In some emerging economies, seizure data is unreliable. Some countries count only seizures by customs, not by the police or other enforcement agencies. So this all casts doubt on the accuracy of seizure statistics. Now, whilst the UK aims to seize, I think, between 20 to 25% of illegal products, maybe around the world, on average, 10% of illicit trade is intercepted. And the interception rate can be as low as 3 to 5% in emerging economies. So an awful lot of illicit product enters our countries. Next slide, please. I won't say much about the FCTC and the ITP because I'm sure you are familiar with those. FCTC was developed in response to the globalization of the tobacco epidemic. And this convention brought the attention of the world onto the many facets of tobacco control. And then in turn, the emphasis moved on to discussions about illicit trade, which led to the Illicit Trade Protocol, which entered into force in 2018. And as far as I know, is the first attempt of a global effort to eliminate illicit trade in a product. And that is certainly something really commendable. Next slide, please. Because the early discussions leading to the ITP were dominated by health experts, the result was an ITP that, in many countries, the customs and revenue authorities were largely unaware would require their resources, skills, and expertise to implement successfully. The silo working of ministries in many countries meant that the health officials had not discussed either the FCTC or ITP proposals with those authorities who would end up having to implement most of the provisions. And here I make a plea from my years of experience as a tax administrator. Please will health officials involve their revenue and customs authorities in any proposals that those authorities will eventually have to administer. Revenue and customs authorities have long been accustomed to dealing with the tobacco manufacturers and importers, especially where very high tobacco tax rates are involved. Often tobacco manufacturers were among the top revenue players. In the UK, and probably in many other countries, revenue and customs officials have been trained to treat all legitimate traders equally, according to their compliance with legislation, not according to the public acceptability of the industry and its products. If a product is legal but taxed, then compliance by the taxpayer is all that matters. So it's a very different mindset from that of health experts and officials. And over the years of the COP discussions, the illicit trade in tobacco products have been changing in its nature. In the EU, the stringent penalties applicable to major tobacco companies as a result of EU agreements had reduced illicit trade in legitimate branded products to a minimum. So counterfeiters and producers of cheap or illicit whites stepped into the supply gap to meet the demand for cheap cigarettes. The illicit market is now filled by large, well-organized and funded criminal organizations. And as Derek mentioned, including terrorists. And they see the illicit tobacco trade as a high-profit, low-risk business opportunity to add to their portfolio of criminal activities such as drugs and alcohol smuggling, human trafficking, arms and wildlife smuggling. And I'd like to touch briefly on another aspect of why some countries have either not signed up to the ITP or failed to implement it. Farmers in some of the poorest countries in the world grow tobacco. For these countries, it's an important export earner. Tobacco growing, its transportation, its use in manufacturing tobacco products, and then the subsequent supply chain all employ proportionately a large number of people. If these people are not to be made destitute, some other crop suitable for growing, onward processing, manufacturing and supply to the same or suitable alternative markets needs to be put in place. Only then will some countries be willing to cooperate fully in reducing tobacco dependence. Similarly, for tackling illicit trade in cigarettes and other products across national porous borders, those involved in smuggling across borders need to have an alternative and legal employment option. And this is all a much, much broader subject than the scope of the ITP. Next slide, please. In view of time constraints, I won't read through this slide. Suffice it to say, I'm not sure that all signatory countries to the ITP have implemented all the mandatory measures yet or enforced them robustly, especially in regard to the controls of free trade zones. Next slide, please. The optional measures reflect areas where presumably the parties failed to agree that measures would be mandatory. And this has resulted inevitably in differences in implementation of the ITP across those countries that have implemented it. Next slide, please. So, given that there is still a vast amount of illicit tobacco products being consumed around the world, what can be done? The remainder of this event is devoted to looking at what has been successful in reducing illicit trade. The legitimate tobacco product supply chains are now largely compliant. The advertising and display bans put in place to deter young people from starting to smoke have also had the unintended consequence of making it easier for small retailers to sell illicit goods to their regular customers under the counter. And now that the advertising ban has been in place for some years, smokers are less and less aware of which brands are legal and which are not. Price should alert consumers to illicit goods, but if a retailer prices cheap whites at slightly below the norm, then consumers can be duped into thinking that it's all part of a special deal. The international and regional enforcement organizations have a track record of mounting successful anti-illicit trade operations. So I suggest the focus should now be on building relationships across all public sector organizations with an interest in stopping illicit trade. Similarly, there's a need to build relationships across borders, seek the assistance of the WCO, Interpol, OLAF or Europol as appropriate. NGOs such as Tracit are keen to help. The WCO recommends implementing the Kyoto Convention Annex D regarding customs controls in free trade zones. And it's important that the Revenue Authority and customs in each country develop their own anti-illicit trade strategy and action plan. All public sector stakeholders need to work together and make use of experts from law enforcement, customs, from revenue authorities who have to implement the protocol provisions. There's a solid foundation now of data and successful operations by the WCO, Interpol and Europol, plus resources such as the proposed controls on the free trade zones. There are also resources available from NGOs such as Tracit and the International Tax and Investment Centre, or ITIC. Next slide, please. So just a quick look at some of the cheap whites that have found their way onto the UK streets. And now I'll move on to the next presentation, please. So while the next presentation is loading, I'd like to share with you some of the history and key aspects of the UK tobacco strategy. This strategy has succeeded in reducing illicit trade in tobacco products despite the UK's very high rate of excise tax. Following the removal of internal customs checks within the EU in 1990, it became increasingly clear that the UK was a key target for illicit tobacco. It was finding its way onto our streets alongside illicit alcohol products, and the trade associations representing manufacturers, transporters, and retailers of these products were complaining vociferously about the amount of illicit tobacco and alcohol products undercutting their sales in local markets. Next slide, please. Excise fraud robs governments of vital revenue that could be used to fund essential public services, including tackling the damaging impacts of tobacco itself. It also robs legitimate manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, and transporters of business and therefore of income. This in turn affects a wide range of legal employment. The public perception of tobacco fraud is one of opportunistic fraud by someone trying to get by, or a sort of Robin Hood sort of action, robbing the government to give to the poor. This is far from the truth. As I've said before, organised criminals, including terrorist organisations, dominate the global illicit trade in tobacco and in many other products. They use the proceeds to fund other crimes, as well as to enrich themselves. The people who carry out the orders of these criminals are often poor and may even have been trafficked into the country concerned, so they cannot get legal jobs. Next slide, please. During the 1990s, a wide range of trade associations and enforcement officials came to realise that with open borders within the EU and widely differing rates of excise and VAT, criminals were exploiting the resulting weaknesses in control. Working directly to a finance minister, I was privileged to lead the first UK review into alcohol and tobacco fraud in 1997-98. The only given that we were not allowed to recommend was that excise rates on tobacco products had to remain high. I set up what was the first joint working party with trade associations covering the manufacturers, importers, wholesalers, retailers, chambers of commerce, freight forwarders, port and airport authorities, and we came up with 90 recommendations, the most important of which were sizing the illicit trade and understanding its nature as well as extent, and developing a strategic approach to minimising this illicit trade. Most of the recommendations were implemented in the next few years with the first UK tobacco strategy published in 2000. Next slide, please. Since 2000, the HM Revenue and Customs tobacco strategy has been refreshed 3 times to reflect the changing nature and extent of illicit trade. HMRC estimates the size of the illicit market using tax gap data, which is reported annually each autumn, and details of this are available online. At the moment, it's in Tobacco Tax Gap Estimates 2017 to 2018, 2019 edition. Building on the success of the first tobacco strategy and recognising the continuing trade in illicit tobacco products, HMRC and the UK Border Force published the latest refreshed strategy for tackling tobacco smuggling in March 2015. Next slide, please. So, what are the key elements of the tobacco strategy? Well, first of all, top-level political commitment to tackling supply and demand. And that is absolutely essential. And the next steps are estimating the size of the illicit market, analysing the scale and scope, investing in a range of operational responses, plus new detection technologies, disrupting the supply and distribution chains, including upstream disruption, by international collaboration, and HMRC placed some fiscal crime liaison officers all around the world to help in this effort. Then reducing the rewards from smuggling by increasing criminal and civil sanctions, reducing demand by raising public awareness, and committing to review the effectiveness of the strategy over time. And nowadays, there's a huge role to be played by data. Data collection, e.g. of imports of key inputs to tobacco production, plus intelligence, trend, and risk analysis all play a big part in ensuring that combined resources are directed at the most effective actions. Corruption is a major facilitator of illicit trade, and of course, it exists to a greater or lesser extent in every country. In some cultures, corruption and patronage are endemic. Corruption is often linked with coercion. While most authorities will have ethical codes and anti-corruption policies, these are not enough. There needs to be action to identify all potential opportunities for corruption and explicit management or systems that put safeguards in place. There also needs to be publicity whenever an official is found to be breaching the ethics code. And why not use the excise tax registration and/or approval provisions to require all excise taxpayers to conduct their business affairs in accordance with an ethics code? In this way, a taxpayer can be sanctioned with a fine or suspension of the right to manufacture, or even withdrawal of the registration approval, thus removing the trader's right to trade in tobacco products. Next slide, please. Now, there are two sides to this problem. One is supply, the other demand. Let's look at how we tackle supply. The cross-government working led by HM Revenue and Customs involves other central government ministries, police, local authorities, port and airport authorities. Widespread collaboration to achieve a common outcome is easier said than done. This is something that definitely requires strong political support, considerable time, effort, persuasiveness, and persistence to get and keep everyone on board. All of the public sector authorities will have their own priorities and will have their own ways of doing things. In so many countries, silo working is often the norm, and getting consumer protection or trade ministry people involved can be difficult and time-consuming. Next slide, please. And I'll just mention a recent example where more than 4 million illicit cigarettes were seized from a warehouse in Glasgow, Scotland by HM Revenue and Customs. The goods are believed to be worth an estimated £1.6 million in lost duty and taxes. Police worked with customs officers who uncovered a tobacco factory during this operation. 3 men between 25 and 34 years old were arrested and charged with excise duty fraud and money laundering offences. About £20,000 in cash was also seized. Now, 50 HMRC officers executed several warrants in Scotland in November 2020, along with 8 officers from Police Scotland. So that's a good example of collaboration across enforcement agencies. And the phenomenon of illicit factories across the EU prompts questions as to whether this is a response to more effective anti-smuggling or supply chain controls, or simply another way to generate even greater criminal profits. Next slide, please. I'll skip through the next few slides, starting with a quick look at HMRC's figures for seizures of cigarettes in 2018-2019. This and the next few slides illustrate the success of HMRC and the border force in making seizures and the penalties awarded, both criminal and civil. It's important to realise that although HMRC and the border force would maintain they're among the best enforcement organisations in the world for illicit tobacco products, they don't pretend that seizures represent more than, say, 20 to 25% of the total illicit tobacco products entering the UK. So an awful lot gets onto our streets. Next slide, please. And this slide shows the seizures made of hand-rolling tobacco in the same year. Next slide, please. And penalties. HMRC's criminal investigation policy states that criminal investigation is reserved for cases where HMRC needs to send a strong deterrent message, or where the conduct involved is such that only a criminal sanction is appropriate. And you can see that we've been very busy. Next slide, please. And on this slide, you see the mention of consultation. The key message here is that the government response must evolve to keep pace with the changes in the risks that are presented by the organised criminal groups. The potential new sanctions that the UK is consulting on are as follows: extending the ability to enforce selected track and trace sanctions to trading standards. Those are people working for local authorities who make inspections at the retail level to ensure that all the appropriate regulations are being enforced. Another area for consultation is a new penalty of up to £10,000 for holding or possessing products that do not comply with track and trace requirements. Then the power to seize any track and trace compliant tobacco products where they are found alongside product that does not comply with track and trace requirements. And finally, the withdrawal of track and trace operator ID from those retailers who are found with products that do not comply with track and trace requirements, or who've had their ability to sell tobacco restricted or curtailed under any other legislation, which could include labelling and contents. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the other side of the equation, and a side that's not often tackled by revenue or customs authorities, trying to reduce demand for illicit cigarettes through public awareness and education campaigns. This has been the really innovative feature of the UK's tobacco strategy. It has been funded by health authorities, and a lot of the action has been taken locally by individual cities and regions under a campaign called Keep It Out. This campaign includes a Facebook group page, local authority surveys, posters in pharmacies and health centres and hospitals, and billboards all around the country. Whilst this sort of campaign can never persuade everyone to stop buying illicit tobacco products, it has increased awareness, especially of parents, about the dangers to their teenage children. And in the areas of the UK that have monitored usage of illicit tobacco products in local communities, there has been a reduction. Of course, this reduction may be due to other factors, such as the general reduction of smoking prevalence in the UK. Next slide, please. And understanding demand. UK research shows that the message that has had the greatest impact on the UK public is that illicit trade encourages or makes it easier for your children to smoke. 70% of illicit cigarette consumers obtain their supplies from a known source, a friend, a family member, or work colleagues, or at social clubs, sports clubs. The UK research source for this is an all-party parliamentary group on smoking and health, who conducted an inquiry into the illicit trade in tobacco products in 2013. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that is a key part of the UK strategy is working with the trade. We have memorandum of agreements with key players, and I do say, don't ignore the licensed tobacco companies. They know better than anyone else what is going on in their industry. Their product is not prohibited, and they are major contributors to the revenue. Next slide, please. And a brief word about supply chain controls. the International Tax and Investment Centre published a toolkit on best practice supply chain controls within the tobacco product sector. It recommended that each player in the supply chain should know their customer and know their supplier, building adherence to legislation into commercial contracts. The FCTC and ITP also require supply chain controls in the form of a track and trace system. In recent years, the development of blockchain and the ability of revenue authorities to use real-time data regarding manufacture, storage and movement of tobacco products may soon make the proprietary tax stamp system yesterday's technology. The UK has implemented the EU requirements for track and trace with scanning at each stage of the supply chain and a registration system for retailers licensed to sell tobacco products. This has exposed a large number of small independent retailers selling comparatively small quantities of illicit tobacco products under the counter. As I mentioned earlier, this may be an unintended consequence of the display ban. And I'll be interested to hear Chris's views on the usefulness of track and trace systems, as to my mind, they may be effective in helping investigators discover where illegal products entered or left the supply chain, but they're not much use at identifying illicit products at the retail level without a large amount of resources to check the codes. Next slide, please. This is not part of the UK tobacco strategy at present because we have no free trade zones, although these may be coming. The World Customs Organization recommends that all customs authorities should operate controls on free trade zones in accordance with the Kyoto Convention Annex D, and it is a recommendation of the OECD Task Force on Tackling Illicit Trade that the operators of free trade zones should be asked to commit to a voluntary agreement about which products, activities and operations are to be banned from free trade zones. And I expect Chris will pick up on this. Next slide, please. And what are the key challenges for government? Well, the most successful programs are those that match the remedy to the problem by first understanding the extent and nature of the illicit tobacco products trade itself, and then devising a national enforcement strategy to target the methods, routes and players involved. This can lead to different solutions tailored to address different types of illicit trading activity or different types of tobacco products in different countries. However, there are some fundamental steps to achieving a successful outcome. These all present challenges for government, so they are listed on this slide. One of the actions I would suggest are modest tax increases in line with affordability. Another option taken by the UK has been to increase tax on the most harmful products, whilst encouraging addicted smokers to change to less harmful products, such as heat not burn and e-cigarettes, with a lower or nil tax rate, rather than for them to move to the illicit market. A joined up strategy, essential for enforcement, improved excise training and awareness for revenue and customs officials. I've mentioned corruption. Zero tolerance of corruption is essential. Targeting key imports that are the inputs for tobacco manufacturing, such as acetate tow and labels. Improving customs controls on free trade zones, including know your supplier, know your customer standards in registration and licensing requirements to improve supply chain controls. Reducing demand through education and a commitment to a continuing public awareness programme at local as well as national level. And finally, partnerships, international, national, and with the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for an extraordinarily informative, practical, and to-the-point presentation. We will turn now to the next panelist, who also comes from the UK, Mr. David Child, now an independent consultant retired from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs following a long career in senior management, where he developed extensive tax knowledge across all revenue and customs regimes and procedures. Over the last 25 years, his specific expertise in indirect tax includes working on excise policy and administration, both as a senior manager and as an advisor in many countries, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. Without further ado, Mr. David Child.
Hello, everyone. I send my greetings to any customs staff listening. I will be drawing on my experience, and it goes back to 1971 as a customs and tax manager, and as a consultant in East and Southern Africa, and also in the Middle East. I have concluded over many years that although all countries are different, we need to do the same things to tackle the illicit trade, as Liz has actually said that over the last few minutes. And I think we need to cover four broad areas. Firstly, enhancing the collection and the use of information. Secondly, improving coordination across government. Thirdly, we need to seek to address compliance in all parts of the supply chain. And then fourthly, we need to try to reduce demand and also disrupt supply. And if you could show our presentation, please, Patricia. Is there a presentation coming? Please, Ewan. Okay, so each of these four areas are equally important, and each are dependent on each other. And I'll now take you through each of these four areas in turn. Next slide, please.
Stand by 1 second. Just getting it set up.
There is a nice picture of you, Evan, but there's no slide.
Please bear with us for a second until we fix this small glitch.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, excellent. So our first focus has to be on enhancing the collection of information on the tobacco trade and on the impact of our efforts on enforcement activities, and also on the development, collection and use of intelligence information. In short, it is vital to understand the tobacco trade in your country, and really understand it. In order to do that, you need to talk to people and you need to listen. You will need to read academic research and assess the true facts and issues. And you may need to get past inaccurate, misleading, emotive, or unsubstantiated information. Next slide, please. You will need to map supply chains, both legal and, if you can, illegal. As I just said, it is important to understand the trade. And to do that, you will need to talk to a large number of players in the trade. So the legal suppliers, the manufacturers, the importers, the distributors, and the retailers. What you're trying to do is to draw up a map of the whole chain, all the way through from the, in some countries, farmers, all the way through to the consumers. And you might be surprised. On the slide in front of you, it gives an example from a country where I established one of the reasons why retailers handled illicit goods was actually because of their payment terms. The legal trade expected payment when they received goods, whereas, I mean, in this case, illicit smuggled goods, it was only after the goods had been sold. So the impact on cash flow of the business was such that it encouraged them to actually purchase illegal goods. So we worked with the legal industry to actually change that, and it affected markedly the attractiveness of actually illegal products. And all of that came from, mapping, of a supply chain. Next slide, please. Thank you. So how do we actually proceed? Or rather, exactly what you need to actually do? First, the legal tobacco industry, as Liz says, will usually be able to tell you where illicit brands are coming from and who is, producing them. And this will give you an idea. It's a starting point. You will also need to talk to the national statistics and others, so you can begin to understand the impact of your activities on price, on demand, on elasticities, and on fiscal losses. And you may also need to commission research. I find in most countries that you need to develop or improve your intelligence function in order to provide enough information in order to drive compliance operations. Next slide, please. Inside of the revenue administrations, and I mean by revenue administrations, tax and customs, there needs to be good coordination, which includes, first of all, having clear managerial responsibilities. I often ask in countries, who is head of excise? And often I am given a blank answer. There needs to be free flows of information. And there between, between customs staff and excise staff, with staff engaged on VAT, including audits, and so on. You need to have working intelligence and information gathering processes. And I stress the word working. And there needs to be staff awareness of the key features surrounding, legal and also illegal products. And and you need to indicate, things that ought to be looked at, during, for example, VAT visits. And you need to make efforts to make sure that the staff have the required skills, e.g. how to search vehicles at borders. There is also a need for good coordination, as Liz mentioned earlier, and Chris will talk more about this later, across all law enforcement agencies. So that is, police, military, all the border agencies, the trading standards people, the agencies who are involved in money laundering, and the agencies involved in tackling organised crime and so on. If smuggling is how illegal goods are actually arriving, then how about talking to the neighbouring countries? and those conversations should include customs to customs and also tax to tax. The one thing I always mention is that smugglers do not pay income tax or VAT. So it's important to have that tax to tax conversation as well. And I mean, finally, talk to the tax policymakers, both nationally and regionally. Ask them to look at the prices of cigarettes in neighbouring countries. If there is a large price differential, I mean, I don't think it matters how good your customs service is. I mean, there is always going to be a flow across, individual borders, which, as Liz mentioned earlier, are often porous. And also, in talking to the policymakers, you need to go past the rates of tax and include, for example, improved or clearer legal powers, and also how to dispose of seized items securely and quickly. Next slide, please. So I'm now moving on to the third strand about compliance, and a focus on compliance is one of the key areas, and you would need to do this in order to tackle illegal trade, and you need to look across the whole of the supply chain, as I mentioned earlier. So you need to start at farmers and manufacturers, importers, the wholesalers, the retail outlets, and also allied businesses. And they are quite crucial here, including transporters and the operators of ports and airports and so on. Next slide, please. And here on this slide are a few things against each of those, individual groups. And as I just said, for importers and imports, there are many things that you can actually do. And this includes, the actual starting point is to actually look at and take care over who is approved. And that includes having an approved economic operator scheme in place. You can use, technology, smart seals, and tracking of vehicles holding tax unpaid goods. In many countries, the leakage into your country comes from transit goods, and you can use technology in order to help you control that. And also you can use technology at ports and airports, especially for the goods, as was mentioned earlier, in free trade zones, or goods at ports awaiting transshipment. Manufacturers, obviously be careful who you allow to be approved. They ought to go through some tests, and you ought to be sure that they are that the individuals are credible and genuine people. You need to audit manufacturing, and also supervise how the goods are produced. You can use, in order to help you do that, you can use technology as well. But the key is to monitor input-output ratios closely, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, and also track inputs and also machinery. Next slide, please. Here there's a box that says input-output ratios, and that's the key thing. You need to track and control inputs. If you do that, and if you know the input to output ratio, you will be, actually having in place safeguards against undeclared production. As everyone knows, I'm sure, a cigarette consists of a number of parts, as actually shown in the diagram. Each part will have an input to output ratio. I mean, obviously the starting point is the amount of tobacco in a cigarette. And then there is a wrapper around, I mean, a cigarette. There are filters. An individual cigarettes go in, I mean, into a packet, and a packet goes into a cardboard box, I mean, a master case. And each of these will give you a good guide as to what has been actually, I mean, produced. And on the screen, I give examples. Obviously, you need to be fair, and you need to adjust for actual wastage, and you need to be careful to ensure that if a manufacturer says individual packets have been, I mean, damaged, ask him to actually hold on to them and inspect them, so that you can be sure that the wastage is accurate. I mean, next slide, please. In addition to tracking inputs into approved manufacturers, it's important to look at, I mean, imports of machinery, rolls of paper, I mean, etc., in order to stop unauthorized factories, actually, being established. If you make good progress on stopping imports, I mean, smuggling, you will find, as one country I worked in did, it did not take long before, I mean, factories started to actually appear in the country. And in that country, there was actually a shift from about 80 or 90% actually being smuggled to 80 or 90% of the illicit trade actually being, I mean, manufactured in country. Things to look for, I have actually put the, I mean, customs HS codes on the screen. So if you track those inputs, if there is undeclared manufacturing, it ought to be fairly evident. If a country has, I mean, tobacco farmers, you might want to regulate the whole trade, including the growing of tobacco, and to continue that licensing through the whole supply chain, all the way through the manufacturing. One key to preventing illicit trade in manufactured products is to have watertight controls in place over the sales of tax unpaid products. I mean, false exports are a common source of illicit goods, so you need to take steps to counter that and to stop people having access to duty unpaid goods from any source. I mean, next slide, please. So, continuing down this list, wholesalers and distributors, you need to look at them and I mean, pay special attention to any goods held by them in a unpaid, either tax or duty state. And that is not just to guard against false exports. Think about duty-free shops, transit goods, and so on. At the retail level, it may be difficult, but if you do make unannounced inspections at shops, hotels, bars, clubs, petrol stations, etc., it will help in order to deter them from selling illegal goods. Also, though, you need to go beyond the individual players in the supply chain and you look at allied businesses, for example, transporters or the operators at ports, airports, and also, I mean, land borders. Only approve those who are reliable and ensure that appropriate and proportionate safeguards are in place. Insist on vehicle tracking, smart seals, and so on. I mean, finally, do not overlook, border controls and the skills and motivation of the staff operating them. I am sure all the customs officials listening will know that land borders are porous and that it is impossible to seal them. I mean, if that is your problem, you will then need to have checkpoints inland at key points, and you'll also need to target where, all the tobacco products are actually ending up. Next slide, please. Now on to the fourth leg of my I am in of the four. If we want to make an impact, we need to do two things. And I have included a diagram of the scale. So what we're trying to do is to increase, upward pressure on one side and actually create a downward pressure on the other. So we're trying to reduce demand by making illicit goods less attractive in the market, in the marketplace. And we're trying to reduce supply by increasing the chances of consequences of getting caught. Next slide, please. So there are a few items on both sides that will help you achieve this. So in order to reduce demand, we might require changes to the labeling and the packaging of legal goods in order to make contraband more noticeable and hence less attractive in the marketplace. You might like to consider the use of tax stamps, but I would urge you to be careful, as they can be easy to counterfeit and be extremely costly and only have a limited short-term impact. You can also target consumers with health, health messages, stressing that illegal goods may be more harmful than legal ones. And if you do make seizures or whatever, you need to publicize that. On the other side, to disrupt supply, you need to increase enforcement efforts, including unannounced visits on individual premises. And if you find illegal goods, you need to take tough action, including seizing vehicles and imposing painful penalties, including asset forfeiture. Your fundamental objective is to increase the risk of being caught in the expectation that it will lead to actually higher costs, which in turn will feed through into higher prices, which in turn will reduce demand and also impact on the profits made out of selling illegal goods. And of course that applies to all the types of excisable goods, not only tobacco. Next slide, please. So in summary, I think you need to address illicit trade by a structured and wide-ranging approach, and it will include all four of these legs, but it will be a different mix in every country. So thank you all, and good luck ahead.
Thank you, David. Extremely informative. In particular, I appreciated the insight into the compliance part of this equation that is, of course, extremely practical and informative. Let's turn now to our last panelist, but not before acknowledging that we are getting questions in the Q&A box, and we will be addressing them to the respective panelists, some of which have expressed an intention to answer them live, but only after our third and last panelist, Mr. Chris Martin, who will be speaking, who will be expanding on the previous presentations and draw on his work as chair of the OECD Task Force on Illicit Trade. Chris has 45 years of service in Her Majesty's Customs and Excise and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, with the past 38 years in criminal investigation and intelligence disciplines. He has wide international experience as a drugs liaison officer and as a fiscal crime liaison officer. He has been actively involved with the OECD Countering Illicit Trade Task Force since 2014, and he has held the position of co-chair of the task force since 2018. This task force works with governments to better understand the full range of complex risks posed by illicit trade to our economic stability, social welfare, public safety, and the environment. Chris?
Thank you, Patricia. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody. I'd like to thank the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World and to Liz Allen for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I do so on behalf of the OECD Countering Illicit Trade Task Force. So the growth of the global illegal economy is one of the most daunting challenges we face today. Its impacts upon our economies and the safety and well-being of our communities are considerable. So look, this is a big international audience, and I recognize we'll have a diverse range of perspectives, experiences, and perhaps a measure of frustration amongst you. But let me begin with an observation that I hope will resonate and influence your thinking on this subject. It's a theme I'll return to throughout the presentation, and it's this: partnerships and collective commitment are the cornerstone to combating illicit trade. Could I have the first slide, please? So today I'm going to describe why illicit trade matters by placing it into a global context, and hopefully convince you that the illicit tobacco trade does not exist in a vacuum. I'll provide an outline of the work of the OECD Countering Illicit Trade Task Force and how it's evolved during the past 8 years from an initial position of wanting to understand the scale and scope of illicit trade to the question, what can we do about it? I'll discuss the convergence of criminal networks, illustrating how governments are often less flexible and agile than the networks that traffic contraband around the globe. We'll cover a number of sectors at risk, including those that have been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. And then I'll move to the subject of particular interest to this forum, illicit tobacco. And then I'll end as I've begun, by emphasizing the need for a multifaceted response. That is, we need networks to fight networks. Next slide, please. So this slide describes the aims of the OECD Task Force. We work with governments to better understand the full range of complex risks and threats posed by illicit trade to our global economies and on our social welfare, public health, public safety, and the environment. The task force was established following an exploratory workshop held in 2012 to assess the harms posed by illicit trade and the illegal economy for global supply chain integrity, economic growth, and market security. And at that time, over 80 experts from government, multinational enterprises, intergovernmental organizations, think tanks, together characterized illicit trade as a growing global threat, one for which no government, multinational company, multilateral organization, or non-profit organization acting alone can design, enact, and monitor effective solutions. So here we are back to my earlier point about a multifaceted response. One of the first functions of the new Charting Illicit Trade Task Force was to undertake research and analysis of the scale and scope of illicit trade. And you'll recall that in describing the foundations to the UK tackling illicit tobacco strategy, Liz Allen told us that her initial priority was to size the illicit trade in tobacco products, to understand its nature and extent, to develop a strategic approach. So it was with the OECD task force to begin by charting the scale and scope through detailed research and analysis into 7 key sectors: trafficking in counterfeit medicines, alcohol, tobacco, wildlife, narcotics and persons, and sport manipulation as an economic crime. Next slide, please. So this slide illustrates a number of the studies produced by the OECD task force. Their purpose is to provide policymakers with evidence needed to understand vulnerabilities and implement effective responses through the introduction of legislation or sanctions, improved governance frameworks, or the adoption of best practice. So look, as an example, the report, Trends in Trade in Counterfeit and Pirated Goods, that was based on the statistical analysis of a unique database of 500,000 seizures of counterfeit goods, in addition to structured interviews with customs and trade experts. There's another report titled, Why Do Countries Export Fakes? And that considers the consequences of poor governments, corruption, bribery, and weak law enforcement that allows the counterfeit and illicit trade to thrive. However, for our purposes today, I'd like to bring some focus to the study, Illicit Trade, Converging Criminal Networks. Next slide, please. So this particular study provides analysis of some of the main areas of illicit trade, including tobacco and alcohol. It looks at what drives and facilitates trafficking, maps the pathways from production to consumer, and describes shortcomings in policies for reducing or deterring illicit trade. It recognizes that criminal networks are active on every continent and in every major economy, and the illicit trade they engaged in has adverse economic, social, environmental, and even political impacts. It asks the question, what is illicit trade? Well, Liz Allen gave us the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization definition earlier. And an important element in that, particularly when thinking about illicit tobacco, is that illicit trade can and does involve goods which are manufactured lawfully, but then enter unlawful supply chains. And in this regard, I'm thinking specifically about cheap or illicit white cigarettes, legally produced in a country with the sole intention of being smuggled into other markets. In 2016, in the European Union alone, it was estimated that these illicit whites accounted for over 1/3 of all illegal cigarettes. Now, this report also considered the phenomenon of convergence and the involvement of criminal networks in different illicit markets. For example, we find evidence of trafficking in persons linked to drug trafficking, illegal fishing, environmental crimes, arms trafficking, maritime piracy, and tobacco smuggling. And we found that if a trafficking route is functioning without detection and can accommodate different classes of products, the opportunity to maximize financial gain provides a rationale to move all types of contraband. The importance of transit hubs is also explored and their characteristics that appeal to criminal enterprises. It's clear if one jurisdiction along the supply chain lowers its guard in the enforcement of laws to prevent trafficking, an opportunity for criminal exploitation is created. So alongside this report, you will also see a document, the OECD recommendation on enhancing transparency in free trade zones. The need for more effective actions to address free trade zone weaknesses has also come to the attention of the World Customs Organization, Europol, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the International Tax and Investment Center. So in all of that, I think we would say there's no smoke without fire. But free trade zones are significant drivers for economic development, investment, and innovation. They facilitate trade by offering businesses advantageous tariffs, lighter regulation on financing, ownership, labor, and taxes. However, the evidence gathered by the OECD shows that they can also offer opportunities for illicit trade. And without additional transparency and oversight, those economic benefits can be jeopardized. Also mentioned the 2019 World Customs Organization research paper, Extraterritoriality of Free Trade Zones, the necessity for enhanced customs involvement. Also highlights how insufficient authority and oversight in the establishment and operation of free trade zones can undermine their economic benefits. So this recommendation was adopted by the OECD Council on the 21st of October 2019. It provides a set of best practice guidance aimed at countering illicit trade and promotes the importance of partnerships among stakeholders. It also urges competent authorities to enhance domestic interagency cooperation and the international exchange of law enforcement information. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned the agility and adaptability of transnational criminal networks and their ability to respond to changes to the operating environment. They're entrepreneurial and willing to diversify when the potential reward justifies the risks taken. And whilst this is a global threat, its effects are often felt locally. Developing countries with a weak rule of law can be particularly susceptible to penetration by criminal networks. And when it takes root, it can undermine human rights and effective development. The Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade has reported that illicit trade from smuggling, counterfeiting, and tax evasion compromises the attainment of the UN Strategic Development Goals in significant ways, crowding out legitimate economic activity, depriving governments of revenues for investment in vital public services, dislocating legitimate jobs, and causing irreversible damage to ecosystems and human lives. The OECD has given attention to the dynamic movements of illicit trade during the COVID-19 pandemic. The growth in demand for pharmaceutical products and personal protective equipment was seized upon by criminal networks, taking advantage of the shifting landscape. And customs authorities reported a surge in seizures in counterfeit medical products, protective equipment, and COVID test kits. And due to lockdown, the online environment has become more intensely misused, and cyber law enforcement has reported e-commerce as the main platform for illicit products. It offers speed, convenience, and anonymity. It was also noted that significant disruption and distortion to supply chains did not deter the movement of illicit tobacco, as traffickers changed routings, or indeed anticipated the impacts of the crisis and stockpiled supplies. The impacts of prohibitions introduced to curb the spread of coronavirus have also been examined. For example, during an unprecedented ban on legal sales of cigarettes in South Africa as an anti-COVID measure, cross-border smuggling thrived, to the extent that it was reported that an estimated 93% of smokers bought their cigarettes from illegal sellers during this period of prohibition. In considering how COVID-19 will shape the serious and organized crime landscape, Europol has said Communities, especially vulnerable groups, tend to become more accessible to organized crime during times of crisis. Economic hardships makes communities more receptive to certain offers, such as cheaper counterfeit goods or recruitment to engage in criminal activities. Next slide, please. So I hope that my foregoing comments bring the subject of illicit tobacco into the broader context of illicit trade and justify concerns about the determination and adaptability of criminal organizations. We've heard from Liz and David about the loss of tax revenues caused by illicit trade in tobacco products. We've heard how taxation and regulation play an important part for governments as part of public health policy to reduce smoking rates. There's growing evidence of increasing complexity in illicit tobacco manufacturing. And I think Liz gave us the example of a factory recently discovered in Scotland. Criminal groups often have multiple manufacturing premises to mitigate the impact of raids on their operations. Alternative distribution channels to continue to emerge, with social media and mobile apps being used to maintain a flow of product to the consumer. Next slide, please. So combating the illicit trade in tobacco products demands sustained effort and commitment. You know, there's no silver bullet in all of this. The UK Tackling Tobacco Strategy demonstrates that the problem can be addressed effectively, even in the presence of high tobacco taxes. When it was introduced in 2000, it was estimated that illicit market penetration for cigarettes in the UK was 22% and 61% for hand-rolling tobacco. By 2015, these estimates had fallen to 15% for cigarettes and 28% for hand-rolling tobacco. This was a hard-won achievement made possible through effective interagency cooperation and the recognition that collaborative networks are fundamental to combating the illicit trade in tobacco products. Now, in this slide, I have drawn upon the Revenue and Customs and UK Border Force approach to summarize the fundamental components to a comprehensive strategy. To promote a wider understanding of the nature of the fraud at home and internationally, to maximize impact and support mechanisms. Now, this takes us again to the point that Liz Allen made. We need to size the problem, the scale and the scope to generate the stakeholder interest and commitment. In terms of preventing, we need to optimize the use of regulatory frameworks to prevent the movement of illicit products all the way along the supply chain. And in terms of our response, we should act rigorously to detect, disrupt, punish, and deter those involved in the fraud. In all of this, I would urge you to recognize the observation made in the first dialogue of the OECD on illicit trade, and that's there. No government, multinational company, multilateral organization, or non-profit organization acting alone can design, enact, and monitor effective solutions. We need networks to fight networks. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Chris, for an outstanding presentation. We have numerous questions that came via the Q&A text box and also through other media. So I will start by aggregating actually two questions that were received and that were addressed or are addressed to Ms. Liz Allen. Namely, how important is Interpol in addressing illicit trade? And is Interpol engaged with the WHO protocol? Also, that's a question for Liz, but of course the other panelists are welcome to try to answer. Given that the World Health Organization and the FCTC really bans interactions with industry and working with industry, how could, in the spirit of fighting jointly as a private public partnership, how could the governments, and how do the governments in fact interact with industry, with manufacturers in particular, to address the plight of illicit trade? Liz?
Right. Well, I should say, first of all, that I've never worked for Interpol, only with Interpol. And so it's very difficult for me to answer a question about whether or not they are signed up to things. I do know that they have worked successfully with a number of countries' customs and revenue authorities to combat illicit trade. And I suspect that Chris will have more information on that. But going on to the second part of the question, how to set up successful partnerships, well, that means sort of forgetting the rule that the WHO came up with about not talking to the tobacco industry. It is expected, as I said, that revenue and customs authorities will talk to the members of the legitimate tobacco industry and work with them. In the UK, we've done this through memorandum of agreement, which are published, and any public meetings about policy are also available publicly. So there is transparency in that. We also provide a channel for the industry to report any suspicions, which we could then follow up. Now, I'm talking from a few years ago when I was involved in that scenario, and I think Chris has probably got more up-to-date information on both counts.
Thank you. Chris, if you wish to add a few words on this.
Yes, please. So to the Interpol question, Interpol are an important partner to the OECD, along with the Europol and other multilateral organizations. Interpol has a dedicated program to illicit trade, and they offer operational and investigative support to fight the global trade in illicit goods. So of course, tobacco is one element of all of that. They're responsible, they coordinate multi-agency task forces, they've delivered regional training, and they do much to raise public awareness of the dangers of dealing in illicit goods, various commodities. And let me also say, whilst talking about Interpol, of course, the World Customs Organization also coordinates multilateral programs and operations against particular sectors, and also offers substantial capacity building opportunities to members. To the earlier question, how do we engage with the tobacco industry? Tobacco industry are a very important partner in all of this, of course. So it is possible, as long as the relationships are clearly framed within, for example, a memorandum of understanding, so that it's clear that neither party exceeds either their responsibilities or their lawful constraints, if that makes sense to you.
Thank you, indeed. But just to try to frame the issue, we've seen some numbers in Liz's presentation, and if I'm not mistaken, in David's presentations as well, in terms of the size of seizures and volumes of seizures and revenue loss. Does any of you have any approximate number in terms of proportion of purchases that are legally purchased, leveraging price differentials again among countries, so cross-border purchases that leverage price differentials among countries with lower taxation, which result in a lower retail price for cigarettes? That's the case sometimes in the US, of course. So does anybody know, or is there any source where we can look at the actual percentage of purchases that are actually basically contraband, so not fake cigarettes, but cigarettes bought in a jurisdiction where, because of lower excise taxes and probably manufacturing costs as well, the legitimate product has a lower retail cost? And that question ties also into, if you have any knowledge of how the duty-free market has a role in that, if any of you wants to share some thoughts.
Well, yeah, I'm happy to, Patricia. It's a great question. And of course, we're talking largely here about legitimate product that's produced for sale in one jurisdiction, which is then moved into smuggled into a higher tax jurisdiction. Are there any figures? Well, there are indicators. So we might find seizures in one country, either at the frontier or through the work of trading standards or their equivalents. And that enables us to track back and say, well, this product was actually manufactured for sale in a different jurisdiction. So there's an indicator there. But we should also be alert, as I said earlier, to the resourcefulness of criminals. And we've certainly seen it where there are regulatory controls over the volume of cigarettes that can be sold in a jurisdiction. So what would happen is a number of purchasers for a very small payment will buy the lawful quantity. They'll then be consolidated and smuggled in bulk to a higher tax jurisdiction. So from the point of view of the country supplying the cigarettes, the sales records would be in good order. There would be no evidence that a substantial amount was sold to any one customer, but it's a fact that the resourceful criminals will buy lots of individual purchases, consolidate them, and then smuggle them.
Yeah. If I may follow up on that, Chris, but shouldn't manufacturers have a responsibility to monitor volumes? So in other words, manufacturers know what's the usual demand in a particular market. It may be seasonal, and there are seasonal changes, but should manufacturers be required to monitor volumes? And once they see that the volumes, even aggregate volumes around, among many retail outlets, increase abnormally, in particular in areas that are close to the border, shouldn't they be required to track those and report, or at least make some note and engage with the distributors? Because what we tend to forget is that the manufacturers actually don't ever sell directly to consumers. There is usually a big distributor in the middle, and even sub-distributor or sub-jobbers, and only at the very last there is a retailer, and that's how the product gets into the hands of the consumer. So should manufacturers be proactive about it as well?
I might like to look to Liz for her more detailed knowledge, but I think what you've described is, fundamental to supply chain control regulation, that yes, manufacturers should only be supplying a sufficient quantity to satisfy the domestic market, and some, of course, there will be sales to travelers, etc. So there should be that effective supply chain control. And in some countries, Liz might know more, of course, sanctions are applied where a manufacturer oversupplies a particular market, then they can be sanctioned and penalized for doing that.
Thank you. Liz and David, if you wish to add anything.
Well, I seem to remember that in doing the tax gap estimates in the UK, there is an estimate of the duty-free goods that are bought in one market and then come into the UK. So that is probably the best set of figures you could get. It does not take account of smuggled goods, but it does show what the duty-free purchases are expected to account for. And I think David has got more information on that from his experience in many developing countries.
Indeed, Liz. I mean, in my experience, the legal trade are extremely helpful. If you do make a seizure, if you pass information on to them as to the, I mean, either the pack markings or the, I mean, or the numbers of the master cases, they will, talk to their, you mean their counterpart company, in a neighbouring market, and it helps them actually stop. If you like, goods intended for, actually for one market ending up in another. So, in my experience, they have been tremendously helpful in that. It is obviously in their interest that, all goods, produced for, market A are actually sold in market A. For example, health warnings are actually in a different language. So there are lots of reasons why. Just on a slightly different tack, I'm working in a country at the moment where the, land borders have been closed for a considerable time, due to COVID-19. And it has given us a unique opportunity in that, individuals have no choice as to where they're actually purchasing from. So if a retailer during the last year has been purchasing maybe 2 or 3 times the amount that they were purchasing previously, now that raises a question about, well, where did their goods come from previously? So there's a tremendous amount of intelligence which I think will be available after the COVID thing has actually passed away. So, all I'm really saying is, if you like, be ingenious, ask questions. A good customs officer is a person who is curious. So if you notice a trend, the next question is why. So I would urge our sort of customs friends listening, think positively, use COVID-19 and the alterations in the market as an opportunity to understand illicit trade. Thank you.
Thank you. And David, now that I have you online, so to speak, there was another question, somewhat unrelated, but of course extremely important. Given that in a number of countries, of course, the police force or some of the enforcement agents are not necessarily known for their integrity. What solutions are there, including artificial intelligence and other types of solutions that you are familiar with, that can remove or minimize the intervention of potentially corrupt, again, enforcement individuals, or make the the information accessible directly to the consumer or more visible to the public at large?
Yeah, obviously, if you're in a poorer country, you are bound to have all sorts of corruption at all levels, including in, I'm afraid, in also customs and tax. All you can do is to engage with those organisations at a senior level, and there is education, there's encouragement, but I suppose at the end of the day, money talks. So there isn't a great deal that you can actually do. I've engaged in, and I don't mind admitting this, corrupt, actions, myself, corrupt in quotes, in that if I go to a land border, I will buy lunch, I mean, for other agencies there, so the customs and the police, you know, so there is an encouragement aspect as well. I think technology is maybe part of the answer in due course. And I mentioned a few times about, track and trace, smart seals on vehicles, unannounced, unannounced checks. I don't think it's appropriate for actually an open forum, but if you do find a seizure, you need to look at all the bits of paper you find, in the vehicle. You need to look at the person's mobile phone in order to get a feel for, you know, how that particular transaction has actually happened. So, you know, there is a tremendous amount that you can do that will maybe give you an insight into any corrupt practices in either your customs or tax service or in other agencies, you know, but you use technology if you can. And as I say, I don't think I want to say, anymore, in an open forum, but if there are other customs people online, they're welcome to contact me through you.
Thank you. Appreciate the insight. Yes, Chris, I was just going to hand the microphone to you.
Thank you, Patricia. If I might say something on the question of corruption, you know, nobody takes this for granted at all. It's a pervasive challenge. I mean, Derek Yak said at the beginning, he referred to a case involving illicit trade in tobacco products and a terror network. And in 2015, the US State Department produced a report that cigarette smuggling is a national security threat and made the links between illicit tobacco profits and funding of terror organizations. So we say, well, you know, corruption is pervasive. And in order to even come anywhere near this idea of having networks to fight networks, that doesn't happen with the flick of a switch. It needs commitment at the highest level of government, and to tackle illicit tobacco, it needs a number of ministries pulling together. The Customs and Tax and Interior Ministries, the Finance Ministry, the Health Ministry, and in all of this, we need to have champions. There needs to be a figurehead in government who says, I'm going to harness all of this resource to lead this very, very significant challenge. It's not just about cigarettes and tobaccos per se. It's not just about lost tax revenues. It's all of the issues that surround it that actually affect our well-being and our security. So, you know, I just wanted to make that point, that saying we need networks to fight networks is something that is hard won, and you know, not created overnight, but it cannot ever happen without senior government buy-in and a recognition that if corruption is rife, then it undermines any valid ambitions that others might have.
Thank you. Thank you. Just for curiosity, any one of you has any statistics as to improve efficiencies once track and trace systems were implemented in developed countries? One of the questions comes from Pakistan, and they're struggling to implement track and trace because of, you know, various local interests. The follow-up question to that was, so again, do you have any numbers in terms of vastly improved outcomes once track and trace is in place? And second, just to follow up on what was earlier mentioned, digital stamps versus manual paper stamps, again, are there any statistics regarding to that, or is it too early? I think the question was addressed to any of you, if you have any data.
Well, let me have a go. I'm not an expert in track and trace, but it is a significant element in the protocol. In the UK at present, there's an initiative. Funding was made available in the budget last year for our trading standards colleagues, those who apply the law at retail level, to also to have track and trace extended to the scope of their work. So it gives us an even broader sight, if you like, on that supply chain. And that is really very good. But a point I would like to make in the context of track and trace is it is the regulated industry who is bound, succumbs to the regulation, the need for track and trace. And yet, I think I said earlier about the sheer volumes of other types of contraband, the illicit whites, the cheap whites, which are dominant in illicit markets around the world, and the manufacturers of those products are not bound by track and trace regulation. So I think in order to achieve a game-changing impact, we need to look very closely at how is it that huge volumes of cigarettes can be manufactured in state-of-the-art factories, distributed all around the world, and yet those manufacturers themselves are not bound by the same rules and regulations as I would call the major tobacco manufacturing companies.
Correct. So you're referring to local manufacturers, perhaps some nationally owned or state-owned manufacturers that, in your experience, tend to be a little bit more resistant, or because of the absence of local legislation, just do not take part into track and trace instruments.
Well, but let's not underestimate the scale, Patricia. I mean, I won't mention the jurisdiction, but in one of the world's major free trade zones, there's substantial tobacco cigarette manufacturing, huge volumes. At one point, it was the #1 non-oil export from this particular country, going all around the world, and none of those products are bound by the track and trace regulation at present. So, we need to create a level playing field for all in order to better regulate and control the illicit market.
Thank you. Another very interesting question, just to follow up on the partnerships between government and industry, which, in principle, it is my belief, and I think it's been stated that they're actually exempted. So governments, in fact, this is the one area, because it doesn't have to do with health, where in fact governments can, and in my personal experience, do interact with manufacturers, in particular customs officers. Can you please provide an example of a specific type of partnership where basically the manufacturing industry have created a task force, or perhaps have a formal understanding? We know the various agreements, of course, but beyond the written agreements, is there actual industry participation? I'm extremely curious in government meetings or industry representation in government meetings or in customs meetings that discuss illicit tobacco issues, or is it just a one-on-one communication with respective manufacturers, just in case of a seizure, or just to follow procedure whenever a shipment is seized to identify whether the product is in fact counterfeit or contraband? Are the governments, or are you aware of any government that actually gives access to anybody from the tobacco industry, involves them, engages them, invites them to participate in events? David?
Yeah, I don't want to name a country, but I was in a country where there was actually an association formed of the three large, tobacco producers and importers, and they had regular meetings, monthly, with the customs and also tax service, and there was a very good dialogue. It was not just passing information on seizures, asking for help in terms of tracing. It was a much more strategic look at at how how things were in fact, actually altering over time. So a very, very good partnership. I was involved in that from about 2008 to 2015. So it was a long-standing arrangement. And I think it was underpinned eventually by an MOU, with a trade association, if you like. So, it actually does happen, but I suspect it is on an ad hoc basis. And it all depends on the relationships in individual countries.
Very true, very true. Liz, do you have any experience with similar interactions from the times that you were in public service?
Well, yes, but we're talking quite a long time ago. And yes, there were regular discussions. And of course, the tobacco companies would seek meetings prior to the annual budget to lobby for, lower tax increases, etc., as other companies would do in for other products. But yes, I am aware that we have a memorandum of agreement with different trade associations, and that's with the trade associations, not necessarily with individual companies.
That makes sense, and bearing in mind that trade associations exist in some countries and not in others, of course.
Right.
And also not all of them enjoy the participation of everyone. We're getting very close to the end of the time allocated, but I would like to ask each one of you, starting perhaps with you, Liz, that you're already online, so to speak, to address in a few sentences, what is the cost of doing nothing? What if we don't step up and escalate the fight against illicit trade? What would be the consequences? And I'm looking for a macro perspective, not only from a simply tobacco consumption point of view. If each of you can share some parting thoughts on that.
Okay, well, if we do nothing, as probably happens in some countries now, then things will just continue along the same trend. As long as the criminals can profit from this activity, and they have very low risk of ever being caught, they will continue. It's as simple as that, and they will increase their activities as long as it brings them more money.
Thank you, David.
That's the risk.
David.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, if you do nothing, it'll grow. It'll go escalate, and from a standpoint of revenue, your revenue will go down. I'm not talking from a health perspective, but just on basic revenue, it will decrease. I would only say that what you need is a clear strategy, and by that I mean, you need to know, have a clear idea as to what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and how will you know if it has actually worked. So those are the key things in my mind. But you do need to do something, obviously. Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you, Patricia. Well, look, if we do nothing, immediately we undermine the ambitions of governments in terms of being smoke-free, and the cheap products continue to be available to the youth and so on. But, this is part and parcel of a bigger global problem. Illicit tobacco trade is part of the global illicit trade, which needs concerted effort, because it's not just about the economic impacts and the social impacts. We've heard how criminal profits fund more pernicious crimes and terror. We've heard child labor in the supply chains. This touches so many aspects of our lives. And unless we address it, then, countries will continue to suffer in terms of their development and sustainability. So it's a committed effort in relation to illicit tobacco, a committed effort into the broader scope of global illicit trade.
Thank you, Chris. Well, we have come to the end of our webinar. I hope it was informative. I would like to thank again the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World for assembling this outstanding group of panelists, and I take this opportunity to thank every one of them for kindly providing insights. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our interpreters, our technical staff, Ms. Aida Urekli, who is behind the Economics of Ending Smoking webinar, as well as the other staff at the Foundation that have been working for over a month now to put this together and longer. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you will continue to join us for similar events. And at any time, of course, for any questions, I know there are contact information for the Foundation on the website, and we hope to have as interesting discussions in the future as we had today. Thank you very much. Wishing you a wonderful day, afternoon, or evening. Until the next time. Goodbye.